Καλησπέρα σας κυρίες και κύριοι. Είμαι η Bono Westcoat, Διευθύντρια της Αμερικανικής Σχολής Κλασικών Σπουδών στην Αθήνα. Με μεγάλη μου χαρά σας καλωσορίζω εδώ απόψε για την τετάρτη διάλεξη μας για την κλασική αρχαιολογία και την ιστορία της τέχνης. Η ομιλήτρια μας απόψε είναι η διακεκριμένη ομότιμη καθηγήτρια Margaret Miles. Είναι πολύ γνωστή στην Αθήνα και στην Αμερικανική σχολή, καθώς υπηρέτησε ως καθηγήτρια Andrew W. Mellon από το 2008 μέχρι το 2014. Το έργο της ως ιστορικός της αρχιτεκτονικής έχει διαμορφώσει σημαντικά την κατανόησή μας για την υψηλή κλασική αρχιτεκτονική, ιδιαίτερα στο επίκεντρο της, την Αθήνα. Σήμερα το βράδυ θα μιλήσει για την πρόσφατη έρευνα της σε τρία βασικά ζητήματα που περιβάλλουν έναν από τους καλύτερα διατηρημένους κλασικούς ναούς στην Ελλάδα, το Hephaistion, η ημερομηνία, το εσωτερικό και ο σκοπός του. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Bono Westcoat, Director of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. It is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our fourth lecture on classical archaeology and art history. Our speaker this evening is the distinguished scholar of ancient Greek architecture and religion, Margaret Miles, Edward A. Dickson Emerita Professor of Art History and Classics at the University of California, Irvine. She is no stranger to Athens and the American School, where she served as the Andrew W. Mellon Professor from 2008 to 2014. In this capacity, she trained dozens of young scholars who are now active participants in the field. Her edited volumes, Autopsy in Athens, Recent Archaeological Research in Athens and Attica, and A Companion to Greek Architecture, were forged during this period. They were preceded by important single-author works on the Temple of Nemesis at Rhamnous and the city Eleusinion in the Agora. Her work as an architectural historian has thus significantly shaped our understanding of high classical sacred architecture, particularly at its epicenter, Athens. Numerous additional publications are on their way, spanning the ancient Greek world from Contrada Mango in western Sicily to Colonnus Agoraius here in Athens, each promising a deep exploration of architectural evidence in the service of fresh and persuasive interpretations. This evening, she will share her recent work centered on three key issues that surround one of the best preserved classical temples in Greece, the Hephaistion, namely its date, interior, and purpose. Please join me in welcoming Margie Miles.
Thank you, Bana, for that kind introduction. Kalispera, Kyries και Kyrii. Είναι μεγάλη μου χαρά να βρίσκομαι εδώ πίσω στην Αθήνα για να μιλήσουμε απόψε για έναν από τους αγαπημένους μου ναούς στην Ελλάδα. Ανήκω σε μια μεγάλη σειρά επισκεπτών που θαυμάζουν το ναό. Πολλοί έχουν μελετήσει το ναό, αλλά φαίνεται ότι ο ναός προσφέρει πάντα κάτι νέο για να μιλήσουμε. My co-author for this work on the Hephaistion is Kathleen Lynch, and we would like to thank the staff of the Agora excavations and its past director, John Camp, for help with this project and permission to study the stored pottery from the foundations of the temple. Here you see him taking measurements from a hydraulic crane, which the Emerita graciously gave us permission to use. I would also like to thank the many friends and colleagues who have looked at the temple with me and made very useful suggestions. The Hephaistion has been admired by travelers to Greece, at least since Stuart and Revett, who studied and measured it in 1752. It was a favorite of subsequent early travelers, in part because it was far more accessible than the temples on the Acropolis, which was still fortified until after the Greek War of Independence. The temple is a landmark above the Agora, and its old name Theseion is still recalled in the nearby metro station. The temple was built on the Colonnus Agoraios, the western edge of the deme of Melite. Today, as you know, visitors approach the temple from below the east side from the modern archaeological park of the Agora excavations. In antiquity, however, the more ready approach was from the west, facing the heart of Melite, and this temple likely started as a deme temple. By the late 4th century BC, there was an informal path up to the temple from the Agora below it, but a more formal approach from below was not built until the Augustan period as part of new alignments and construction that made the Agora more like a forum. As one of the best preserved classical Greek temples in the whole Mediterranean, history nonetheless has marked the temple with many bullet holes, and many of its column drums were shifted over time by earthquakes in Athens. Ancient lexicographers refer to the Hephaistion on the Colonnus Hill, but the identity of the temple as the Hephaistion was not confirmed until the Stoa Basileus was discovered in the early 1970s. Its position corroborates Pausanias's topographical description, and the identity is no longer disputed. As Mrs. Corremi Spezieri and others have pointed out, the Theseion should be sought further east, somewhere under modern Plaka, north of the west end of the Acropolis. Various parts and aspects of the temple have been studied recently. Judy Berenger, Jeremy McInerney, and Andy Stewart have focused on the architectural sculpture. Laura Ficcucciello and Riccardo De Cesare on its connections with Lemnian history and its setting in Caimonian Athens. Giulio Vallarino and Giovanni Marginesu, among others, on inscriptions that illuminate its cultic history, and Enzo Lipolis on architecture. In this paper, I focus on just 3 aspects. My co-author Kathleen Lynch and I redate the start of the temple's foundations and the period of its major construction. We present a new reconstruction of its interior without a hypothetical colonnade and with wall paintings instead. We also argue that the cult and festivals for Hephaistos and Athena together were of particular interest for the silver industry in Athens. The temple was turned into a church of St. George, perhaps as early as the 5th century CE, but more likely in the 10th century, as Bente Killerick has argued recently, a time when Athens acquired the status of a metropolitan seat. The Christian builders constructed an apse on the east end, dismantled the cross wall of the pronaos, and punctured the walls with 5 small doors. Over the centuries until 1834, some 66 tombs were dug inside and around the church when the pavement of the temple was pried up to accommodate them. In 1835, the temple served briefly as a repository for antiquities. In this view by Edward Dodwell, made with the help of a camera obscura, you can see the 5-sided apse in the east peristyle, and if you look closely, you will see a ceiling coffer and other ancient architectural blocks built into the apse. In Dodwell's view of the west end, notice how even the fairly deep foundations of the temple are exposed. This is why we have to rely on finds inside the temple for its starting date. In the mid and late 1930s, the Colonnus Agoraios was excavated by the Agora excavations of the American School, with Dorothy Burr Thompson as supervisor. Here she is with her crew. At first, she focused on the vicinity of the temple and discovered the remains of a carefully planned garden of the 3rd century BC, built around 3 sides of the temple. The garden was replanted in the 1950s with myrtle, pomegranate, and laurel. After her happy discovery of the garden, she began the rather unpleasant task of excavating the Christian graves in and around the temple. She did this in the early spring of 1939, just as Mussolini was annexing Albania in preparation for the Italian invasion of Greece on the eve of World War II. Her notebooks are considered among the best in the Agora, and in them she provides careful and vivid detail of all aspects of the excavation. Some of her findings inside the temple were published in 1941 by William Bell Dinsmore as his Observations on the Hephaisteion. Thanks to Dorothy Burr Thompson's careful excavation of the graves and her documentation, the pottery kept in storage, and Dinsmore's close and precise observations, we can revisit the findings of some 84 years ago for this new assessment of the history and design of the Hephaisteion. The temple was built on the north shoulder of the original peak of the Colonnus Hill, on a slope that runs from southeast to northwest, so that the foundations of the temple are especially deep along the south side and the west end. The peak of Colonnus Agoraios no longer exists because it was trimmed first in antiquity, again between 1860 and 1862, and further again in the early 20th century for an outdoor movie plaza. This is discussed by Sylvie Dumont in her study of the neighborhood Versaki. This photograph that you see was taken in 1955 from an airplane, and it shows how flat the area is today underneath the garden, which was replanted by the staff. I'm going to see if I can point this out to you here. There we go. So the garden is rebuilt here, and this is the part that was leveled 3 times, so it's very, very flat today. During its long use as the Church of St. George, when gravediggers dug up the interior and peristyle of the temple, they cut through much of the original stratigraphy of the ancient fill. At the east end in the peristyle, there are a few blocks of the original pavement still in place where the apse had been constructed. For the graves in the peristyle and opisthotomus, the gravediggers cut through the edges of the fairly soft porous blocks of the foundations, which you can see here. Fortunately, Dorothy Burr Thompson found undisturbed fill preserved beneath and between the edges of the graves. She was able to see the inner sides of the foundations of the walls of the temple, which included reused marble blocks that were only partly finished. I'll say more about those later. Inside the cella, the graves were placed less evenly and more of the foundations were cut, so that the configuration of the original interior of the temple presents a challenge for architectural analysis, which I'll discuss in a moment. There was one area of ancient fill toward the back of the cella, which she called Area A, and that fill has been especially useful. My co-author, Kathleen Lynch, studied all the relevant lots of pottery stored in the Agora, from areas both inside and outside the temple. I focus first on her study of the pottery found in the interstices of the graves. Professor Lynch's study is the first thorough examination and listing of this context pottery, which had not been published, discussed, or described, except for a brief comment by John Papadopoulos in 2002 in the course of his publication of a geometric period amphora that was preserved among the context pottery. He was the first to notice the early 5th century date of this pottery. Dinsmore did not use the pottery excavated from inside the temple for dating the temple. Instead, he chose to support his 440s date for the construction of the temple with pottery found in a rock-cut pit some 33 meters to the southwest of the temple. This is deposit C9:6 in the Agora's nomenclature, which you see here in red in the plan in the lower left there. Dinsmore believed it represented a dump of construction fill because of marble chips and other debris it contained. Yet Lynch has found that the pottery dump itself, despite the construction debris, does not date the original setting of the foundations. The pottery from the rock-cut pit does not contain votive or dedicatory material from the sanctuary of Hephaistos in Athena, and instead contains primarily shapes associated with dining debris. Its significance for identifying another shrine on the Kolonos Hill, the Eurysakion, will be addressed elsewhere by Professor Lynch. The construction debris does confirm that some work was going on for the nearby temple in the mid-century, probably the ongoing sculpting and painting of the architectural sculpture. Here is Professor Lynch's plan showing where undisturbed or relatively undisturbed pottery was found by Dorothy Burr Thompson inside the temple, relevant to the original laying of the foundations. This information is based on sections and plans in the notebooks and shows 14 patches of undisturbed fill around or under the later graves. The 4 best preserved areas are shown in orange from the center of the cella. These areas of fill yielded some 1,509 sherds kept in the basement of the Stoa of Attalus. The 14 patches of fill have consistent layers, and I show here a representative section of Area A found near the foundations for the cult images. The lowest levels, found over bedrock, date to pre-construction levels early in the second half of the 6th century BC. The latest datable material from these fills, associated with the construction strata of the foundations, goes to 480 BC. Although many of the 1,509 sherds are small, Professor Lynch could discern that among them there are no markers of the cleanup after the Persian invasion of 480. The ceramic markers are now established from the very well-documented horizon of Persian destruction debris found in many wells in the Agora and published by T. Leslie Shear in 1993. Inside the temple, there is no mid-5th century pottery, not even a scrap, but pottery of that date was found as fill under a cobbled street about 7 meters west of the temple, showing that plenty of such pottery was available for fill if the construction had been that late. Among the 1,509 sherds, there were many worn earlier sherds of the Bronze Age through 6th century, probably from graves on the Colonnus Agoraios. We conclude that the foundations for the temple must have been laid in the 480s, before the Persian invasion and the destruction of Athens. The date in the 480s, provided by the ceramic evidence for the original construction of the foundations, also corresponds to the introduction of the cult of Hephaistos, paired with Athena, into Athens. This happened after Miltiades' takeover of the island Lemnos, which was the main center for the cult of Hephaistos. In fact, almost the only center of the cult of Hephaistos until it was moved into Athens. There is some evidence for a possible cult on the slopes of Mount Etna and Lipari, but apart from that, this is an unusual establishment. The Italian excavators on Lemnos, such as Laura Ficcucciello, have pointed out that soon after Miltiades' land grab of around 500 BC, there is a cultural reception of Lemnian themes in Athens, embracing mythography about Pelasgians and Lemnian stories in tragedy and comedy. Pausanias makes clear in his narrative about the temple that the pairing of Hephaistos and Athena was reinforced further by the attention to a family triad, with Erichthonius as their child and Gaia herself as the birth mother. The triadic aspect of the cult reflects the theme of autochthony, which was to become so essential to Athenian self-imagery throughout the course of the 5th century BC. The late Archaic date for the start of the temple is corroborated further by the design of the foundations. They are constructed of 3 types of porous limestone of varying hardness and color, including Piraeus limestone. Dinsmore states that in mode of construction and techniques, the euthynteria and lowest porous step should be contemporary with the foundations. Thus, they too were part of the pre-Persian construction. Here are views of the lowest porous step. One peculiarity Dinsmore describes in considerable detail, based on Dorothy Burr Thompson's excavation, is the clear mismatch between the porous foundations and the current marble superstructure. The peristyle of the west end is not centered over its foundations, but perches on their inner side, with some of the columns even overhanging the foundations by about 3 centimeters. The foundations for the western cross wall between the aposthotomus and the inner cella also extend considerably westward, with the marble wall set as far east as possible, so that the foundations appear to have been intended to support a wall further to the west. The foundations for the cross wall between the pronaos and the cella also suggest repositioning. In addition, the marble cella flank walls are not centered over their poros foundations, but are set as far apart as possible, so as to form a wider cella. The foundations were intended for a longer temple, slightly longer, perhaps as much as a meter, with a narrower, slightly longer cella. This is a more archaic plan, as Dinsmore himself notes, which could even accommodate a peristyle with 14 rather than 13 columns on the flanks. Here are reconstructed plans of the late archaic design, showing a hypothetical version with 6 by 14 columns at left, and version B with 6 by 13 columns in the center. To me, this version, B, seems the most likely for the late Archaic period in mainland Greece, in contrast to Sicily, where the 6 by 14 plan was favored. The late Archaic foundations of the first Hephaistion were built about the same time as the Temple of Poseidon I at Sunion and the older Parthenon, both burnt by the Persians. The demes of Sunion and Melite, presumably wealthy, were in the forefront of responding to the first Persian invasion at Marathon, along with the population as a whole, who honored Athena on the Acropolis with a major new temple on its south edge. Excuse me. Although the lowest step is porous limestone, the original intention for the Hephaistion likely included a marble superstructure, for in the foundations today, just below the level of the marble walls, the excavators found 4 unfinished Doric capitals of Pentelic marble, 3 under the north wall of the cella and 1 under the south wall, and 5 marble blocks suitable for a stylobate. At least 2 of the stylobate blocks have stippled vertical projecting panels framed along the bottom with a cavetto molding, similar to those on the older Parthenon, there at an appropriately larger scale. The significance of the narrower, somewhat archaic design of the foundations eluded Dinsmore. He recognized 2 phases of construction, but he viewed the Hephaistion as built in one continuous project within 4 years after the start of the Parthenon, and he explained away the earlier configuration as an error. He thought the wider design of the cella to be not a modernization of proportions on top of earlier foundations, but instead an expansion for a hypothetical interior colonnade. Dinsmore posits the existence of an interior colonnade primarily on the basis of a stray marble beam from the modern cross wall of the temple that he interprets as an upper architrave for an interior colonnade, together with a vertical scratch line on the Ticobate near the west end of the cella. It's about 1.47 meters from the cross wall, and served as his guideline for the return of the colonnade. This block and scratch line have inspired 5 articles. For Bert Hodge Hill, Gorham Philip Stevens, and Oscar Bernier all contested the configuration of Dinsmore's colonnade, although they believed in its existence, and then Dinsmore wrote back to refute their interpretations. Dinsmore interpreted the foundations as supporting a pie-shaped colonnade because of extra buttressing along the flanks. He suggests that the motive for the change in plan was the architect's emulation and rivalry with Ictinus Parthenon. In the case of the Parthenon, however, an inner colonnade was needed structurally because of its wide interior, which is some 19 meters wall to wall, made possible by octostyle facades and its overall large scale. The free span across the inner stylobates of the interior colonnade is almost 10 meters. When the width of the inner colonnade is added, half from each side, the total span between the inner colonnades is about 11 meters, 0.076, approaching the outer limits for a wooden ceiling. In contrast to the Parthenon's interior width of some 19 meters, the interior of the Hephaisteion is 6 meters 24 wall to wall, a normal width for a hexastyle temple of its scale. If there had been a colonnade as reconstructed by Dinsmore, it would span less than 4 meters. There was no structural need for an interior colonnade in a temple of this modest size. By about 500 BC, architects had a growing confidence about spanning interior spaces with wooden ceilings, and they had access to appropriate timber from northern Greece for construction in the mainland and islands, and the Basilicata, an area around Mount Etna, for temples in South Italy and Sicily. Most temples of this size and period do not have colonnades, unless, as is the case at Aegina, for example, they deliberately repeat a previous design from a previous iteration. I conclude that the shifted, wider design of the cella in Hephaistion is best explained as an effort to modernize the proportions of the plan when the existing marble superstructure was started around 465. I suggest this buttressing was added because the primary purpose of temple foundations was to improve the load-bearing capacity of the poor quality bedrock and to drain away the water from the temple. In addition, architects began to pay attention to aseismic properties with base isolation, at least by the 6th century BC, and the notorious earthquake in Sparta of 464 might have inspired some concern. A sufficiently wide foundation, called a spread footing for the cella walls, was needed for aseismic protection and for general subsidence, and the extra layers made up for the extreme positioning of the marble walls that Dinsmore had noted. Here is what I mean by base isolation. The inner building is connected to the outer peristyle only at the level of the ceiling and in the front of the temple with the pronaos frieze course. In an earthquake, the outer peristyle and the inner building can shift independently. The interior of the temple should be reconstructed without the unnecessary hypothetical colonnade. This allows for the proper placement of the base for the cult statues and a larger, more usable interior space. I would like to note that we are not the first to challenge the colonnade. Herbert Koch did not include one in his study of 1955, and doubts have been expressed in print by Brunhilde Ridgway, Colin Edmondson and William Wyatt, Fred Cooper, and Angelos de la Vorias. The treatment of the walls of the Hephaistion shows that its architect had quite a different idea about how the interior was to be presented to the deities and to human visitors. The interior cella walls have a well-executed stippling, more pronounced than the decorative stippling in the pronaos and opisthotomus, that continues across the drafted margins and borders of the individual blocks. The neat but slightly rougher and larger stippling extends across the surfaces above the orthostates to the full height of the wall visible today. The medieval vault covers the very top of the wall. This was accomplished with at least 3 different tools, including the claw chisel and 2 points with different widths. Moreover, the interfaces of the wall blocks have a V-shaped vertical channel that was filled with lead, some of it still preserved in the 1930s. And I've looked hard at everything visible there today, and I don't see any trace of the lead anymore. But Dinsmore himself, as well as many other observers, comment that there was some to be observed back then. All students of the temple assume that every wall block of the interior cella had such channels on both ends, above the orthostate course to the top of the wall, and that the intention was to waterproof the walls. Still today in the cella, there exist patchy layers of stucco ranging from 2 millimeters to 1.5 centimeter thick that extend over the first 6 courses above the orthostates to a height of close to 4 meters from the reconstructed floor level. Bert Hodge Hill went up on a ladder and cut a hole in the medieval vault, and he observed a very thin coating of stucco on the walls, even at that high level, in his investigation of course 17 that was otherwise covered by the medieval vault. Further scrutiny of the interior revealed that at least 4 types of stucco are preserved in patches, including many superimposed layers. The roughest and thickest are near the ante of the pronaos and are clearly medieval, belonging to the period when the temple was a church. Some of this thick, spongy stucco still partially covers holes in the marble walls, patched with sherds and small stones. Another type of somewhat less thick stucco is rough and pinkish with lots of sandy inclusions. A third type that is preserved only in the cella itself has already been described in detail by Gorham Philip Stevens and includes straw, mostly impressions of straw, but some straw is preserved. He presents this as an ancient type of stucco with comparisons elsewhere. The fourth type, preserved only in a few places, is fine, hard, white with a slightly chalky appearance and was applied thinly but very smoothly directly onto the marble wall blocks. This fourth type, perhaps not seen by Stevens, certainly appears to be ancient, as preserved only in the inner cella. Evidently, the interior of the temple has been stuccoed and painted multiple times in its long history. I hope that someone with scientific expertise will undertake a proper analysis of the various layers of stucco. Literary testimonia make clear that sanctuary buildings contemporary with the Hephaisteion did have mural paintings in their interiors. We would expect this period of high creativity in wall painting, made popular right at this time by the work of Polygnotus in the Stoa Poikile and in the Leschi of the Cnidians at Delphi. In the case of the Hephaisteion, the exceptionally careful preparations for a stuccoed, painted wall were actually made and are visible today, as is some of the stucco itself. Even though their imagery is lost, the archaeological evidence and the literary testimonia for the existence of murals indicates that they were a widespread feature of temples and stoas in 5th century Athens. The highlight of the interior was the statue group, bronze cult images of Athena, Hephaestia, and Hephaistos made by Alcamenes of Lemnos and installed in 415 BC. Their reconstruction has been complicated by Dinsmore's proposed interior colonnade. On the left, you see a much repeated design with the statues crammed into the interior, and on the right is Eve Harrison's design based on her study of the financial accounts for the statuary, listing the amounts of bronze that were purchased for the project. Her reconstruction is larger and would not fit among the columns as the temple was then understood. She had such confidence in her reconstruction that she rejected the identity of the temple as the Hephaisteion and proposed instead that it was a temple of Artemis Euclea. Her reconstruction, however, would fit inside the Hephaisteion without the colonnade. Yet I myself cannot accept the large functional chimney, which would pose a significant fire hazard in the temple and its attic. We present a new reconstruction of the interior here with Olga Palia's suggestion of the Churchill Athena as the basis for the Athena, along with the workman type of Hephaistos that was praised by Cicero, who saw the statues. The statues are shown in our drawing here at a minimum size, and they could have been larger. We give a figured base, simply exempli gratia, and we add wall murals simply as a demonstration of how they might have looked. In the play Ion, Euripides has Ion mention a scene of the birth of Erichthonius just as it is represented in painting. We add appropriate furnishings for the interior. I'd like to emphasize the distinctive cultic purpose of this temple. Of course, the primary purpose of any Greek temple was to honor the deity and protect the image and possessions of the deity. But over time, the cult of Hephaistos and Athena Hephaistia, as patrons of technology and metallurgy, acquired additional social and practical importance, since the state mint and production of coinage were naturally under their purview. This is attested in at least 3 inscriptions of the later 5th and mid-4th centuries BC, beginning with the Standards Decree. Furthermore, the name ta Hephaistikon is listed in the financial accounts for the Parthenon and Propylaea and in 4th century BC mining leases. The name apparently refers to a mine in Lavrion named after Hephaistos, as Ron Stroud has pointed out. The impact of Hephaistos' correlation with metallurgy was most salient for the silver production industry, which involved tens of thousands of workers in a wide range of occupations, including slaves, medics, and citizens, and was dominated by very wealthy men of Athens, such as Nicias. Hephaistos is, of course, well known as the bronze workers' god, just as Athena is also patron of the pottery industry. But in matters of cult, silver production seems to have been the predominant motive because of the sheer number of people involved in it. The 2 deities were celebrated and honored in Athens during festivals Hephaistia, which included bull lifting and a torch race from the Academy, and the Chalkia, when the loom was set for Athena's peplos to be presented in the Panathenaea. The festival Hephaistia was a significantly large celebration with a board of 10 hieropoioi and possibly a second board of 10 selected to arrange it, that is, assuming that IG 1382 refers to the Hephaistia, which I think is very likely. Specific provisions were made for the participation of medics, and 200 men were chosen for the bull lifting. The numerous participants, the special boards, the prominence of the festivals, and the elaboration of the temple with architectural sculpture, large bronze cult images, and painted murals are a testament to the powerful influence of the silver industry in Athenian society. As divine patrons of metallurgy and technology, the deity's support was needed for the industry that made possible Athenian imperialism. Eve Harrison was the first to make good use of IG 13472, a partially preserved financial record for the construction and installation of the 2 bronze statues. Lines 155 to 160 describe 3 operations: the installation of the statues in the base, the erection of fences or barriers around the 2 statues, and for the doors, the making of scaffolding for the statues and ladders giving access to the scaffolding. We suggest that some of the wood and bronze stipulated in the account might have been used for barriers around the statues, as suggested by the text, like those found in other temples, but also for the grills set between the ante and the columns of the pronaos and the opisthotomus. Fine cuttings for the marble sills supporting those security precautions exist on both ends of the Hephaistion, and precisely cut dowel holes for the bronze and wood grills exist on the columns of the aposthotomas. The columns of the pronaos are completely rebuilt, and in fact, the northern bottom drum actually belongs to the Temple of Ares, so we wouldn't expect to find the dowel holes there. In his study of the grills, Gorham Philip Stevens states that the installations are so similar to those in the Parthenon that he found it impossible to say which set of gates was the earlier. The grills had wooden jambs and lintels, probably sheathed in bronze, with lockable gates. Because Hephaistos and Athena Hephaistia were so closely associated with coinage in the mint, it seems probable that ready money was kept there, convenient to the Agora, the mint, and the state officials needing access to currency. With a deep pronaos and aposthotomus, there was more space for storage. Just as in the Parthenon, security for the storage of valuables made the grills and gates necessary. In both temples, the grills are finely designed and precisely installed, and they appear to be contemporary with the construction of the buildings. As for the date of the superstructure of the Hephaisteion, I'd like first to quote Francis Penrose, an astute observer of Athenian architecture, from his publication of 1851. He says, "The temple of Theseus, although surpassed in grandeur and richness by the Parthenon, is not less harmonious in its proportions and is equally refined and perfect in its construction." And he assumes it dates earlier than the Parthenon. Since Penrose's observations, the stylistic date of the marble superstructure of the Hephaisteion has been debated within a range of about 475 to 415, bracket dates given by the presumed association with Chimon's retrieval of the bones of Theseus and the date of the installation of the cult images. One indication of the date of the temple that has not received much notice is the profile of the cyma, in part because it had been confused with the one for the Temple of Ares. There are at least 12 pieces preserved of both Parian and Pentelic marble. The similarity of the profile and the lion's faces on the Hephaisteion to an earlier island group centered on Delos is a helpful indication that the marble roof was fully completed along with the rest of the temple, certainly by 460. In a study of the mason's marks on the ceiling coffers published in 1984, William Wyatt and Colin Edmondson posited that the temple had a long period of building from at least 460 to about 420 because some upper parts of the building have stylistic features that appear to belong to the 420s, including the style of the lettering on the ceiling coffers that they were studying. But we need to take into account what happened in the 420s. Athens felt 2 earthquakes in 427-26, according to Thucydides. Damage caused by them has been observed in the Parthenon, in the Keramikos, and elsewhere in the Agora. For the Hephaisteion, William Dinsmore Jr. already observed evidence for damage and quick repair on the basis of the acroteria in his study of the roof, published in 1976. Another example of someone who gives very precise descriptions, so it makes it possible for us to interpret that. He wasn't mindful of nobody really was thinking about the earthquake when he was publishing that, but he says it looks as though it was repaired right away, and he's mystified by why there are so many dowels and clamp holes there, and he concludes it had to be repaired for some reason. Such repairs in the 420s would also account for the discrepancy in letter forms of the mason's marks on the ceiling coffers that were discussed by Wyatt and Edmondson. It seems highly probable that such repairs were needed after the earthquake, given the peculiar design of the coffers that had removable lids on top of grids that were actually hollow. The interior sculptured friezes were carved at some point after the slabs for them were already in place. This is shown by the figures crossing over joints and the flattening of objects such as boulders near the top or the crest of a helmet. The lower parts of some of the moldings are a bit wavy along the bottom, but the upper parts are precise and presumably were cut on the ground. In assessing all the evidence, we conclude that the generally accepted chronology of a long period of construction should be revised to a shorter period, 465 to 460. The temple was built all at once as a Chaemonian project, a date already urged by scholars of Lemnos and Chaemonian Athens. Assuming about 5 years for construction in the heady days after the Athenian victory over Persians at the Erymanad River, we should consider the temple mostly finished by about 460, up to and including the geison, the marble ceiling, and the marble roofing system, the lion's head flank and raking cymas. At mid-century, what needed to be added was the pedimental sculpture, acroteria, and perhaps the murals. So, in conclusion, by about 460, the temple looked very much like this, the way it does today, except that it had a new, shining white marble roof, edged with an elegant lion's head cyma. Thank you.
Margie, thank you so very much for that incredibly rich and inspiring lecture. I'd like to open the floor for questions here and also online. We have one from Katie in the front.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting. This might be something of a simpleton type question, but do we have any information about the existence of any pedimental sculptures, or did this not have that?
Information about what?
The pedimental sculpture, or was this devoid of that?
Oh, yes, there's quite a bit of it preserved, and Andy Stewart has published it quite recently in Hesperia. So he worked through all of the fragments, and if you want to read up more about that, I didn't want to infringe on his work, but it's right there, yes, in Hesperia.
Thank you, Margie, for a really interesting talk. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the aseismic developments and how this worked. I mean, are we to imagine then that in an earthquake, the idea was that the exterior colonnade could collapse and leaving the central building, the naos, stable? I mean, how was that working? I'm just not clear.
Well, the base isolation just simply means that they were tied together at the roof. So yes, what you just said, that in theory that would happen. Now, in fact, the Hephaistion has been subject to quite a bit of earthquake movement. So when you see the blocks, let's go back to one of the images here. It's actually one of the first ones, but I think you can see it. There. If you look closely, actually the one with the bullet holes shows it too, a lot of the drums are displaced. And it's really interesting, I found in the Agora archives a drawing made by Richard Anderson showing that there is a difference in the displacement on the north flank and the south flank. And he thought that it was because the south flank got much more sun and that somehow that affected it. I'm not quite sure that that's right, because part of it would be that the north side has much deep, the foundations are also hanging over more the slope of the hill. But I think that we can see these efforts to prevent earthquakes as a matter of experimentation. But as you know, Athens is not all that subject to earthquakes. And we see it more elsewhere in other building sites that were much more subject to earthquakes. But I think that those techniques were a concern. And I really do think, it may just be fantasy, that the earthquake of 464 did wake people up to the possibility that this kind of thing could happen to them as well. But in an earthquake, it's better to have things be able to move a little bit laterally rather than having everything tightly connected. And I think that that's still a principle in construction.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margie. This is, I like your dates. It really opens many fruitful historical questions. So, one clarification. Normally, when we have a noun of the form Hephaisteion, Aiakion, we're talking about a sanctuary, and there would be a temple inside the sanctuary. And this is important to me because we have later references where people go to the Hephaisteion when they plan to meet to torture some slaves and the like. And do you draw a distinction between the broader area of the temple and the temple itself? In the broader area devoted to Hephaistos, activities might take place that are not necessarily the ones taking place in the temple. And then my second question is, given the timing of this, can this temple be read as essentially Kimon's victory temple after Eurymedon?
Sure, I think that we can speculate about those connections, but there's really not much firm evidence other than the chronology itself for that. As for the use of the term as an area designation rather than a temple, that's quite interesting, but I think that we'll have to wait for Kathleen Lynch's study of the whole Colonnus Agoraios hill before we can really answer that. She's taking on a project of looking at other nearby shrines. Olga.
Margie, thank you for this wonderful lecture. Excuse my ignorance, but is it true that some of the roof tiles are Parian marble and some others are Pentelic marble?
Yes, it is true, and I would assume, as per previous discussions that you and I have had, that probably Parian was the original and the Pentelic ones could have been the replacements after the earthquake. But I don't think anybody's actually gone through the hundreds of fragments again and correlated them, so that would have to be left open for future research. That is, Wyatt and Edmondson say that there are both kinds of marbles, but I don't think anybody's tried to correlate whether the fragments that have the letter forms that appear to be later are only on Pentelic, and the letter forms of the original are only on Parian. So that kind of detailed study has not yet been done. But the two types of marble do exist. Also for the Sima, the lion's head Sima, there are some Pentelic pieces too, instead of all Parian.
Margie, I'd like to let you know that your online audience is very active as well. So if I could share a few of their comments. Susan Wood just thanks you for an excellent lecture. And Tony Usabelli says, what leads you to conclude it might have been a Deme temple? Is it, if it was a Deme temple, what does that imply for its use?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm glad he asked that, because I wanted to say more about that. It's within the boundary of the deme of Melite, which includes the Colonnus Agoraios. And that was established by Gerald Lalonde in his study of 2006. And so you would assume that if it's within that deme, that it really is part of that deme. And in fact, that deme was a fairly well-off deme as far as we can tell. But it actually also has a further ramification. Let me just, again, go back to another slide here. Yeah, I think this slide shows it best. Kathleen Lynch had this plan made on the basis of the study of the notebooks, and it includes these paths and roadways that you see here, for which there is archaeological evidence that this whole network of paths, and notice that the entrance to the temenos of the sanctuary is here, very close to this cobbled street that you see along here. Now, if we go back to the plan that I borrowed from Jerry Lalonde's book, remember that I was just showing you a road here. So if we had a finer plan that showed all of the network, you could see that it's all looking westward. Now, it could be observed that the metapiece, obviously on the exterior, faced down into the Agora, but nonetheless, it's the west side that was where people came and went primarily. So I do think that it was part of the deme temple, and the implication of that is that if we begin to think about the funding of the project, for which we have absolutely no evidence, so it is mere speculation, it should include the idea of that this was a deme temple, the way that the Temple of Poseidon was a deme temple for Sunion, and the Temple of Nemesis at Rhamnous was built by the people of Rhamnous. So that's really why I wanted to emphasize the fact that it's a deme temple. However, it could be that that designation was irrelevant, and that the money that was kept in the temple was there for the use of the state as a whole. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't know enough about this kind of distinction, and I don't think it is known whether who would have controlled the finances if we don't have inscriptions that tell us that.
Thank you. And the questions go on. Jennifer Niles would like to know, what about the date of the metapiece, which must have been carved on the ground?
Well, I think that those two would be in the 460s. Yeah. Okay.
Jeff Barno asks, are there other sites or texts related to the Hephaistos-Athena liaison?
Are there, I'm sorry.
He says, sites or texts that combine these two divinities?
Well, they're associated in inscriptions, quite a few inscriptions, and also in many literary testimonia. But there are no other sites where the two are put together. This was a special concoction that came from Lemnos, and the two paired together are only here as far as I know. There is an altar dedicated to, or testimonia for an altar dedicated to Hephaistos and Prometheus in the Academy. And there was an altar to Hephaistos in the Erechtheion that Pausanias mentions. But other than those three places in Athens, Hephaistos is absent. So the pair really is primarily and apparently uniquely at this temple. However, the recognition of the pair, particularly their parentage as Erechthonius, is something that you can find and has been very thoroughly studied by Alan Shapiro and Jacqueline Clements on the issue of autochthony.
Okay, this makes it really interesting. Okay, all right, we continue with Ingrid Edlin Barry, who says, does Lucy Schumert's study of the moldings agree with your dating? Thanks.
Yes, in fact, she was an inspiration because she had the courage to oppose Dinsmore's dating. So yes, if you track down each one of her moldings, she says what she thinks, and it goes along with what I have put together. Yes, she's a heroine.
In honor of International Women's Day. Okay. Chris Cloak says that, Margie, thank you so much for your wonderful talk, which I just watched with all of my class in Maryland. Congratulations to you and Kathleen. I realize this relates more to her part of the project, but can you comment about whether the pottery you and she examined had any particular functional coherence that might characterize prior use of the area in the late Archaic period?
No. No, I'm sorry. They were the pottery from inside the temple was very ground up, the 1,509 sherds, and not enough to talk about that at all. The pottery from the rock-cut pit, 33 meters away from the temple, is gorgeous. In fact, that's how I tempted Kathleen to look at it, because it was so beautiful. And she will be discussing that in her own presentation.
Great. Martha Payne says, thank you very much. Could you say how the excavations of the Stoa Basileus supported that the temple is the Hephaisteion and not the Thesean? You had mentioned that at the beginning of your lecture.
Yes. Already in the 1870s, there were several Greek scholars who surmised that it was the Hephaisteion. Eudyke gives a citation of all of the earlier literature. So the idea that it was the Hephaisteion had been out there from fairly early on. And then, in the course of the 20th century, there were a variety of opinions about whether it was the Thesean or whether it was the Hephaisteion. By the time of the excavations of the 1930s, there was a opinio communis among the Agora excavators that it was the Hephaisteion. And yet there was still uneasiness about it because, after all, the exterior metopes do show Theseus, and there were still the ideas there that had been floating around really since Stuart and Revett. Now, back in the 18th century, a well-read gentleman certainly would have read Plutarch's Lives, and I think that they were very influenced by the life of Cimon. The way that the Stoa Basileus finally resolved the issue was that its identification is about as certain as you can get for an ancient building. It comes about from the dedication of a herm that actually has on it the occasion that it was dedicated by an Archon Basileus. So it's almost like a label on the building, and it was found in situ on the north end of the building. You could go out there and still see it today. So that's how we know that the Stoa Basileus is the Stoa Basileus. So that is an anchor point. Then, if you turn to Pausanias's description, as he's walking into the Keramikos, he says, you walk by the Stoa Basileus, and you look up, and there is the Hephaisteion. So it's the passage of Pausanias. I'm giving you a shortened version of it, in correlation with the inscription found on the steps of the Stoa Basileus, that make the identity really quite certain. And also, I should say, too, as I mentioned in my talk, that the literary testimonia for the position of the Thesean really puts it further to the east and north of the west end of the Acropolis. So it's not just that there are contenders for the temple, but the other contender for the Thesean really should be somewhere else.
Okay. Jeremy McInerney says, given that the foundations go back to the very early 5th century, might we expect that the first temple was planned by Miltiades, but was abandoned following his disgrace? The Commonian temple would complete his father's work and help rehabilitate his reputation.
Sure.
All right. And a last question online, Lena Papianou. It says, thank you for the opportunity to attend this lecture online. Great information about the Hephaisteion. I am joining from Houston, Texas, and I hope you will share the recording. Perhaps with that, if we have no further questions online and in the audience, we might also share a glass of wine with Margie.
Great, thank you. Thanks.